Hi, it's Mr. G here, and today we're going to be going through 5.3 Elasticity and Pricing. So, the first thing we're going to look at is, does raising price increase revenue? And it really comes down to whether we have elastic demand or inelastic demand. Remember, when we're looking at this, we're only concerned with looking at demand, not supply. So, we're looking at, is it an elastic demand, is it inelastic demand? And so if you notice with elastic, as one goes up, the other goes down. And with inelastic, as one goes up, the other goes up. And that's the best way to remember it. And often I would show my students visually, it's, like one goes up, the other goes down, and, moving your hands that way. And so with an elastic demand, as price increases, revenue decreases. They move in opposite directions. As price decreases, revenue increases. And we'll kind of look at why that is in a little bit. Inelastic demand, only demand, not supply. As price increases, revenue increases. As price decreases, revenue decreases. Okay, and so that essentially is the rule. So you can always remember it's the opposite with the elastic. It always goes the same way with inelastic. And so that's the way you can determine without actually having to do the calculation. Of course, you can always calculate the revenue at each point and figure out, well, is it going up or is it going down? That obviously would work as well. But as a quick way, you know that this holds true. So if we look at some examples here, and so I'm going to show you some of the examples here. So the first example I have is cost to produce wheat decreases due to new technology. And so what this is talking about is we have some new technology that came into wheat production. And from new technology, it reduces the cost. So in this particular case, you can see that our supply is shifting to the right, so it's increasing. Now, notice that I tried to get them as close as possible. They may look a little bit off, but essentially the idea is still there. But you look at our demand lines. Well, the first demand line is very inelastic. Remember, more vertical is more inelastic, more horizontal is more elastic. So if we look at the first example, an inelastic demand, you see something very interesting with the increase in supply. So the price goes down dramatically. So we had an improvement in wheat technology. It's more inelastic, so the price got reduced dramatically. But the quantity supplied and demanded didn't change a lot. So that's typically what happens with inelastic demand is, it'll have a big effect on price, but the quantity demanded supplied didn't actually change a huge amount. Let's look at it now when we have a more horizontal demand. In this particular example, what are we looking at? Well, the price went down very little. Compared to an inelastic, the price actually only decreased a very small amount. However, the quantity demanded supplied actually increased a lot. So what's this saying? Well, it's very sensitive to price. As price goes down, the demand goes up a lot. With the inelastic one, it was saying as the price went down, didn't really change the demands, quantity demanded, quantity supplied by a lot. And so we can see in this particular case, the demand, in this particular one, the quantity demanded, quantity supplied, did increase quite a bit. And so this is with elastic demand versus an inelastic demand. So you can start seeing where the shape of the graph and the angle of its slope have a big impact essentially on what's happening. And I always recommend to students to actually graph this. A lot of times they'll ask me questions, and I'll have around my piece of paper, and I'll quickly do a graph. And there I can figure out the answer by just interpreting the graph. If you try and think of it mentally, it actually gets a lot harder. So I always encourage students, I always tell students, graph it. Just graph it. You have a problem in front of you, graph it. And have a look at what the result is and use that to figure out your answer. And that is the best way. Well, what we're going to do in this case is we're looking at demand increased, in this particular case for ice cream. Okay, and I'm just using some random examples. I'm not saying that, you would normally have an inelastic supply, for ice cream. Depends on the situation, etc. I'm more interested in looking at the effect. So demand is relatively the same. We can see that demand increased. I tried to keep the demands looking exactly the same angle, etc. in both graphs. Now, if we look at the first one, we have an inelastic supply. So we dealt with inelastic demand, elastic demand. Now we're doing an inelastic supply. And so in this particular case, when we have an inelastic, the increase in demand, what happened? Well, the price jumped up by a huge amount if you look at it. So the price went up dramatically, but quantity demand and quantity supplied once again didn't have a huge change as a result of that. If we look up here with inelastic demand, we had the same kind of results. Huge thing to essentially price, but not a huge change in quantity demanded supplied. Now, with an elastic, you can see that it resulted in just a small increase in price, but as a result, a huge change to quantity demand and quantity supplied. Same kind of result on what we had here with an elastic demand, okay? So you can see where the differences come in. And so if you're answering a question, you want to really just graph it and see what the result is for each one. All right, so let's go through some of the impacts and what actually changes for elasticity in terms of demand and supply. So if we look at it, we have for demand, what makes something more inelastic or more elastic? So the first one is availability of substitutes. All right, so if we look at it, more substitutes, more elastic. So the more substitutes there are in the market, so there's lots of different places that sell coffee. If the price goes up dramatically at, say, Starbucks, well, maybe you go to another place because you're like, well, they have just as good coffee and I don't have to pay the higher price. So the more substitutes are, more elastic. Less substitutes, more inelastic. If there's only one place in town that sells coffee, you're kind of limited in what you can do. I guess you can make your own coffee, but if you want to go out for coffee, you're just stuck with the one place. Okay, less substitutes, more inelastic. Remember, I say more inelastic. It doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a fully inelastic curve. It just means it's more inelastic than the other one. And so you can just make it a little bit more vertical. That's making it more inelastic, but it doesn't have to be necessarily fully vertical, etc. Next one is necessity of a good. If a good is more a luxury, it's more elastic. If you think about it, you know, like, am I going to go on a trip this year? Essentially, I can afford it, but, you know, I think because it's so expensive and I'm not sure about my job, maybe I'll push it off. So when things get worse, you know, higher things that are more luxury items are the ones that are more affected by price. If it's more necessity, like, say, your medication, well, as the price goes up, you're like, well, I still need my medication. I can't do without that, so I'm going to still purchase it, even though the price went up dramatically on it. Higher percent of income, more elastic. So if you're buying a new car, well, that's a huge amount of your paycheck is being spent on that car. So it's a way more elastic decision for you. If it's a stick of gum and it goes up 10%, well, if you think about that, that's going to be more inelastic. Why? Because a stick of gum doesn't really cost you a lot, so it going up 10%, you might not even notice the price difference. And so you would just buy it. So it's much more inelastic. It's much more elastic when, of course, you're dealing with a higher percentage of your income. Things that are highly branded, so you think fashion, other kinds of things, you know, brand names that you know, with a lot of advertising, they tend to be more inelastic as prices go up. People are just like, I want that brand, and so they will pay for it. Ones that are low branded, that people don't know, no names, they're much more sensitive to price as well. Now, if we look at supply, it's the same kind of idea. So we have here the more suppliers, the more elastic. Okay, so more suppliers in the market, the more elastic the supply is. Less suppliers, more inelastic. If it's easier to switch production, more elastic. So if you could produce this product or another product, you're going to be like, well, I'm not making a lot off this. So, you know, if you think about a coffee, okay, I can make coffee, or I can make, hot chocolate or something like that with the machines. Then you might be like, well, I'm not making a lot of coffee, so I'm going to make more hot chocolate. So if you're able to easily switch between it, it's much more elastic. If it's harder to switch production, it's more inelastic. You think some factories, where they produce aluminum or something, there's only really one thing you can produce with it, so you're going to be much more inelastic. You can't really switch productions. If it's easier to store a product, more elastic. So if you think about, any kind of metals or other things like that, they can often store them for long periods of time. They don't go bad. However, if you have vegetables, well, you can't really say, I'm just going to store it for 2 years until the market's better. Everything would be rotten. I mean, you could freeze them, but it wouldn't be the same. So if it's easier to store a product, it's more elastic. If it's harder to store, it's more inelastic. So supply for often vegetables and everything else tend to be more inelastic. And then one more last point. In the long run, both supply and demand tend to be more elastic. And in the short run, it's more inelastic. And why is that? Well, in the long run, we can always make changes. So in the long run, I could, if I'm supplying a good, and it's very inelastic now, I might decide to shut down in the future. Okay, I still have to keep going in the short run, but in the long run, I might make other decisions, or I might make I want to increase production, so I can buy additional machinery in the future. So it tends to be more elastic in the long run. People's demands too. It's like, well, gasoline. I don't really want to pay it, but I have a car. So I have to use gasoline. But in the long run, I might decide I'm going to buy an electric car instead. And so, a long run tends to be more basically elastic. In the short run, much more inelastic because you don't have the decisions that you can make in the long run. Okay, so that's it for this section. A lot of different things to learn, so you really got to practice with it. I'll be back then for 5.4. Okay, bye for now.